Morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on the time zone you're joining us today, or if you're watching recording. My name is Victor Monga. I'm a CSA LA board member. Today we are joined by Beshoy. He is our speaker for the day. So I'm just gonna talk about the basic stuff, and then he's the one who's gonna review module 3 with you guys. On the screen, you see our contact and recording information. So all of these sessions are recorded and put on YouTube for you to review it later on. Keep in mind, these are study group sessions. They're not meant for official training. We do expect you to go through all the modules, all the units, all the domains from official CCSK training. And I'm going to cover more of that information in a couple of slides. If you have any questions regarding CCSK, training, study group, if you're not sure what's going on, please send an email to learn@csala.org. Also, make sure you all are connected on our social media because that is where we post all of these event recordings. Myself and Anil are acting as moderators. We are not certified CCSK trainers. We are just here on moderator capacity. Today we have Beshoy. He's our speaker for the day. Beshoy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Beshoy Farag. I am a student from Nashville, Tennessee. I go to McGavick High School. I'm a freshman, and yeah.
For those who didn't get those free CCSK tokens, you can still get 20% discount, and you will have to use the code Train Anywhere. It's applicable until May 31st, so make sure you get that before it runs out. For those qualified members who got free training, I'll tell you this, it was a long process, it was a lot of commitment, and it was a passion from us. And all we are asking in return is your commitment, that you make sure you're paying attention to it, what we're doing. We're really passionate about it, what we are offering. At the same time, we do expect it. Our motivation is your success. All right, about CCSK exam. We cover it every week, so I'm gonna breeze through it. There are 14 domains, 6 modules in the training, and there's only one exam. There are about 60 questions. You get 90 minutes and 80% to pass. And I took a stab at it last weekend and I passed it. So if I can pass it, you all are pre-qualified to pass it, assuming you do CCSK training. So make sure all of you guys are paying attention to the training, and all of you guys will pass CCSK exam. I'm confident. As far as it goes to schedule, every week, Friday, 4 p.m., it's gonna set schedule. We are covering week 3, module 3 today, so we're kind of halfway through. We have 3 more weeks left. Module 1, if you have gone through it, you should have gone through it. It should have taken you between hour and hour and a half. You should have learned and reviewed resource pools, essential characteristics of cloud, service models, deployment models, and the most important thing that we keep trying and talking about in industry, shared responsibility. So in module 1, we had 6 units, and you should have learned all of these topics that we just covered. Now, with that, module 2. So we covered infrastructure as service security. We also covered SDN. We talked about different networks for management, storage, for service. We talked about different planes that we also refer in SDN world: management plane, control plane, data plane. We also reviewed the packet capture challenges, the way we have been capturing packets for analysis on-prem data center versus how we capture in cloud now. So all of this was covered in module 2. It should have taken you guys between 2 hours to 2.5 hours, and there were 7 units. So it was a bit of a lengthy module, but I'm sure all of you guys have covered it. All of you guys have reviewed it. This one is kind of recap and review from the last module. We talked about it, how outside we are right here, and this is all cloud computing happening. The abstraction that we see based on the consumption model, service as software as service, platform as service, or infrastructure as service, we see different layers. So I was just kind of recapping that, reinforcing it, make sure you guys understand when you are consuming the cloud, it's not as simple or similar to what we do in our traditional IT infrastructure, which is we also refer to on-prem data centers. With that, I'm going to hand it off to our young speaker, Beshoy. All yours.
So governance is the overall management structure of the organization. And so governance has like three major components. You got contracts, which define the relationship and legal agreements between the cloud provider and consumer. And then you have supplier agreement assessments, which will tell you how well, or will tell you how you know the provider will do what you expect. And then you have compliance monitoring, which is the cloud reports to the customer and the customer reports to the cloud to show that they're meeting requirements. And so that's all in the like overall management structure of the organization. And we call that governance, right? And then a subset, so governance manages a lot of things. And so you have a subset of governance is enterprise risk management, which is that group of people or that branch of governance. They manage the entire risk for the organization, like their financial data, their IT risk, and other risks. And so a subset of enterprise risk management is information risk management. And that is how we manage risk around our information assets and resources. So like our customers' data, like our customers' data, our information assets like our banking information and things like that. And then a subset of that is information security, which is like cybersecurity, as y'all know. The effects on the different service models. So if you have infrastructure as a service, with infrastructure as a service, when we move it up to cloud, we tend to treat it like a normal data center. So like the risk and management controls are very similar to a regular data center. But the metastructure is very different in cloud because when we do cloud, cloud comes up from two different things, like as we covered in unit 1 or module 1. We have abstraction, which is pulling out the resources, and then orchestration, which means we automate the resources or automate the resource pools, and that's like the metastructure and the management plane, right? And so that's different with infrastructure as a service when we push it up to cloud. But then platform as a service, right? When we have platform as a service, you really can't negotiate contracts with your cloud provider because obviously your cloud provider doesn't want you like writing or doesn't want you to try and negotiate contracts because they want to like make it normal, especially with like public cloud. They don't want you negotiating contracts because they want everyone. They want to distribute their cloud to everyone, and it might be hard to figure out if you are meeting the expectations of a contract with platform as a service. So we have these things called SLAs or service level agreements, which are like, I don't know much about service level agreements, but you know, they basically let us know if we're meeting the expectations of the contract. And then it really, in platform as a service, it all comes down to how well you integrate the details of your like platform business model to the service models and the way you do business. With infrastructure as a service, you can rely fully on the contract to define the governance. You rely fully on the contract to define the governance and risk management portion of your business, because with infrastructure as a service, or with software as a service, with software as a service, the cloud provider is selling you the software itself, so you don't have access to the underlying infrastructure, and so you can't control the underlying infrastructure, right? And you know, like they always say, with no power comes no responsibility. There's lots of variety in the market on what cloud providers you use. So like with software as a service, there's a lot of different varieties, and a lot of them have different contracts, and then you have to manage your own risk. Any questions, or am I going too fast?
I think it was good. Again,
Great. Yeah, thank you.
everybody. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, great. No, good speed, Beshoy. Thank you.
Okay. And then what's basically different, or you gotta use less things, so you have less control of your physical assets. And so you need to manage risk. Like what happens when a cloud provider chooses to accept risk that you necessarily don't want to accept as a business? Well, then you need to manage it and put it into your BCDR, which I think was in module 2, or which stands for business continuity and disaster recovery management model of your business. So you need to have a way of dealing with that if the provider chooses to take risks that you necessarily don't want to take. And then you obviously want to rely more on SLAs and contracts, which require you're going to be required to manage the risk that the cloud provider already has, because like the cloud provider isn't going to like really respect you because you're like a consumer, right? And they have a lot of other consumers. So like you're going to have to manage your own risk, and you're going to have to stay up to date. And obviously the cloud providers won't let you do pin testing, which is kind of a difficult thing, because obviously the cloud provider can't tell if it's a pin test with a pin test, if it's an attacker or if it's you. And so you got to do assessments instead of pin testing. Yeah. Any questions?
I'll make a few comments if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing I will say is you noted that you'd want to know like a risk in your BCDR. That's true to an extent. Can you go back to this previous slide?
Oh, yes.
That's true to an extent, man. But one thing I would take into consideration is there are different types of controls that you might be responsible for to mitigate the risk that you're expecting the cloud service provider to give you. So like if BCDR is an aspect that you don't have or that you need more control over, then obviously the service provider is going to give you like they're not going to not give you anything. Well, they might not, but to an extent, there's certain like things that they'll cover, and then it's your responsibility, like you mentioned, to yours as an organization. I mean, your responsibility to mitigate any of the excess risk, right? And that might mean like maybe this is an extreme example, but like maybe it means having another service provider that has a replica of the information you have in that service provider. So really, it's not just focusing on BCDR, but it's taking into consideration all the aspects of risk that you take on when you take that service provider on, and whatever it is you're leaning on them to give you. And things like that you typically find noted in like a GRC tool where you track those types of risks and the types of controls that you're putting in place or the decisions you've made to mitigate the risk, whether it means accepting it for what it is or implementing controls to mitigate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So how compliance, how the cloud changes compliance. Okay, so how, as the cloud customer, you are essentially responsible for being compliant. So usually the cloud relies on third-party assessments to ensure that it's compliance. And then there's this thing called compliance inheritance, which is, so if I, for example, before compliance inheritance, without compliance inheritance, if I tried to distribute an app on AWS that's compliant, then all of AWS, all of Amazon has to be compliant. But then with compliance inheritance, the cloud provider, Amazon, gets certified, and then I'm only responsible for what I deploy into Amazon. And so you're not everything with the provider you have control of or the scope to look at. And so you need to make sure your app is compliant, but it's ultimately your responsibility. And then the provider gets pre-certified. If the provider's pre-certified, you get to inherit their compliance. And that basically gives you but it doesn't mean that your app will necessarily be compliant if the provider is compliant, because you still have to be compliant. So in short, you're responsible for what app you use or what app you deploy into the cloud, especially with so obviously we looked at the shared responsibilities model before. With infrastructure, you're more responsible because you have more control, because with great power comes great responsibility. But then with platform, you're a little less responsible but you still are responsible, because you don't have access to the underlying infrastructure, but you have access to like the platform, like the app itself. And then with software as a service, you're less responsible because the cloud provider manages all the underlying stuff for you. Yeah, so, but mainly like in the eyes of the like for compliance purposes, right? The customer is always responsible for compliance. Any more questions?
Yeah, I'll make another comment too. It's Edward.
Yeah.
One thing that I will say is when we say compliance here, I'm pretty sure they are referencing like legal or regulatory. So CIS benchmark is a really good like tool to look at. Just make sure that you tie it back to like what your organization is responsible to adhering to, because those are ultimately going to be the requirements that you're going to expect your third parties or your vendors to also abide by when you take them on, like a cloud service provider.
So the last part of the module, we talk about the Cloud Security Alliance's tools for managing, the Cloud Security Alliance's tools. And so they have, the Cloud Security Alliance has a couple tools. One is CCM, or the Cloud Controls Matrix. And so the Cloud Controls Matrix is a list of security controls. It's made for cloud providers and those who are administrating software as a service. And it's got 16 domains, 133 objectives, and 6 like classes, I think. And so it normalizes the security expectations in the cloud provider supply chain, and it helps the cloud provider when building a risk assessment. Also, this was a note in the training. Most of the questions on CSA tools, Cloud Security Alliance tools, come from the Cloud Controls module, because like all the other tools kind of build on top of the CCM, the Cloud Controls module. The second tool that the CSA provides is the CAIQ, or CAIQ, which is the Continuous Assessments Interactive Questionnaire, right? So the CIA's CAIQ assessment is a 295 yes, no, or does not apply questions. And these questions help to evaluate a cloud provider's security. It lets customers and auditors to ask the right questions from the cloud provider and look at their risk models. And they all are color-coded and mapped to the CCM, the one from before, the Cloud Controls module. So you can look at, so all the 133 objectives and the 16 domains and the 6 classifications, each question is mapped to those. So there's 295 questions and they all map to those. And then if you answer them, it's a good assessment of how your company is doing with security. And then the STAR registry. So the STAR registry, basically, if you see the way it's building up, right? So the CCM is like the actual security controls, and then the CAIQ is like the how do we evaluate the security controls, and then the STAR registry is how do we manage all of the company's evaluations and third-party audit certifications. So we look at, so the STAR registry basically is a registry that has a bunch of different companies. All those different companies have taken the CAIQ assessment, the CAIQ, and then they put it in the STAR registry, and then you can keep track of it. Now, StarWatch, which is the last tool, is a software as a service, which we talked about in Module 1, app, right? That lets cloud providers manage the stars, their star-like entries, and lets anyone read the star, the star for a particular company. For example, like I think it's at CSA-star registry or something. And so you can go and read it. You can read the likes and download like the questionnaires for certain companies and see how they answered, what types of questions they answered, yes, no, or what types of security things don't apply to the particular company. And so it has like a web interface and an API call, but I think the API is for like CSA premium members or something. So thank you. All right, so these are just examples of the star registry and things like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Web Services, and then there's the certain levels of star certifications, or like certain like groups. They group things in the star registry, I think, by level. And then this one tells you, like, you can see based on star level, you can see like, oh, if they're a star level 3, then they have the highest level of transparency and the best level of assurance. But if they're star level 1, they have less transparency and less assurance. And then these are like the requirements for each of the levels. Any questions?
Not from me. Thank you.
I have a question. When we
Go
say
ahead.
level of assurance, can you elaborate what they mean? I mean, I know what assurance is, but like, what do they mean?
Yeah, I'll take that one if that's okay, Beshoy.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah. So at the end of the day, it depends on. So if you go to the previous slide, we're talking about how we evaluate these levels, and an assurance is based on the CCM and cake that we have put together. So if as a cloud provider, you're supposed to have certain things to evaluate your environment,
Yeah.
that is what assures your consumers or customers that, okay, this person or this cloud provider is following these practices. They assured
Ah,
based on that.
okay, got
So
it.
yeah, and again, keep in mind you're gonna review all of this in a depth during the CCSK training course. This is just to give you guys kind of highlight and foundation starting points that this is coming in the course. You learn a whole lot about it in CCSK training.
Yeah, no, it helps. It helps like frame the way I should be looking at it. So it helps.
Awesome.
It helps a ton.
Awesome.
Okay. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you, Victor, for letting me speak and for helping get me prepared.
No, thank you, Beshoy. Seriously, I mean, I'm really proud of you right now. You're a high school student, and you are preparing for CCSK, and you are a speaker today during our session today. So definitely, hats off to you, and round of applause. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you.